Young doctor changed bandage for female millionaire in a coma. Shockingly, she woke up and the morning shift at St. Vincent's Medical Center began like any other for Dr. Matthew Hayes. But there was something about the soft September light filtering through the hospital windows that made him pause in his routine. At 31, Matthew had been working in the neurological intensive care unit for 6 years, dedicating his life to patients who often couldn't speak for themselves, who relied entirely on the compassion and skill of their medical team. Matthew's brown hair was always slightly tousled, despite his efforts to keep it professional, and his genuine smile had become a source of comfort for families facing their darkest hours. He approached medicine not just as a science but as a calling, believing that healing happened as much through human connection as through medical intervention. Room 314 had been occupied for 3 months by a patient who had captured the attention of everyone at the hospital, though not for the reasons that usually drew such interest. Victoria Ashford, a 28-year-old businesswoman, had been in a coma since a car accident that had made headlines not because of the crash itself, but because of who she was. The Ashford family fortune, built through generations of successful investments, had made Victoria one of the youngest female billionaires in the country. But wealth meant nothing in the face of traumatic brain injury. Victoria lay still and silent, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spun gold, breathing with the assistance of machines while her family maintained a constant vigil. The other doctors treated her with professional competence, but Matthew had noticed something that troubled him. She was becoming more of a medical curiosity than a person to many of the staff. Matthew had made it his practice to talk to all his coma patients, believing that somewhere in the silence, they might still be listening. With Victoria, he went further. Every morning when he changed her bandages, he spoke to her about the weather, about books he was reading, about the small moments of beauty he'd noticed during his commute to work. "Good morning, Victoria," Matthew said gently as he entered her room, carrying fresh bandages and speaking in the warm tone he'd use with any conscious patient. "The leaves are just starting to turn outside your window. I think autumn might be your favorite season. There's something about the way the light hits your face that suggests you appreciate beautiful transitions." The nurses, Sarah and Jennifer, watched from the doorway with a kind of professional interest that came from seeing doctors develop different approaches to patient care. They'd both noticed that Matthew spent more time with Victoria than strictly necessary, that his touch was particularly gentle when adjusting her position or checking her responses. As Matthew carefully removed the bandage from Victoria's arm, where the IV had caused some irritation, he continued his one-sided conversation. "I was reading about a study yesterday that suggests coma patients can sometimes hear and process more than we realize. I hope you know that you're surrounded by people who care about you, who are committed to helping you find your way back." What Matthew couldn't know was that Victoria had indeed been aware for weeks, trapped in a body that wouldn't respond to her desperate attempts to communicate. She had heard every word he'd spoken to her, had felt the difference between his touch and that of the other medical staff, had come to long for his morning visits as the only light in her frightening darkness. Victoria had been fighting to wake up, but her body seemed disconnected from her will. Until today, as Matthew's gentle hands worked to clean and rebandage her arm, speaking to her with the same respect he'd show any patient, something shifted. The combination of his kindness and her determination finally broke through whatever barrier had been holding her in unconsciousness. "Matthew," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible but unmistakably present. Matthew froze, his hands still holding the fresh bandage, his eyes immediately focusing on Victoria's face. Her eyes were open, blinking slowly as she tried to adjust to the bright room after months of darkness. "Victoria." Matthew's voice carried a mixture of professional excitement and personal joy that surprised him. "Can you hear me? Can you see me?" I can hear you," Victoria managed, her voice strengthening slightly. "I've been hearing you. Every morning. You told me about the leaves changing. Matthew felt tears spring to his eyes as he reached for the call button to alert the other medical staff, but he never took his gaze away from Victoria's face. "How long have you been aware?" "Weeks," Victoria said, trying to sit up slightly. "But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. You were the only one who talked to me like I was still a person." The room quickly filled with medical staff, all marveling at Victoria's awakening, running tests and checking her responses. But through it all, Victoria's eyes kept returning to Matthew, the man whose voice had been her anchor during the darkest period of her life. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the head of neurology, conducted a thorough examination that confirmed what seemed miraculous. Victoria had suffered no significant cognitive damage and appeared to be making a remarkably complete recovery. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Reeves told Matthew privately. "In my 25 years of practice, I've rarely seen someone emerge from such an extended coma with such clarity." Over the following days, as Victoria regained her strength and prepared for discharge, she and Matthew developed a friendship that surprised them, both with its depth and naturalness. Victoria learned that Matthew had chosen medicine after losing his younger brother in an accident, dedicating his life to helping families avoid the helplessness he'd felt during his brother's final days. Matthew discovered that Victoria was nothing like the cold business executive he'd expected. She was thoughtful and curious, asking about his life and interests with genuine care, sharing her own dreams of using her wealth to make a meaningful difference in the world. "You know," Victoria said one afternoon as Matthew was finishing his shift, "I've spent most of my adult life surrounded by people who saw me as a means to an end. Business associates who wanted connections, suitors who wanted access to my fortune, even friends who seemed to value what I could provide more than who I was. That must have been incredibly lonely," Matthew said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "It was. But lying here, listening to you talk to me every day, I realized that you saw me as a person worth caring about, even when I couldn't give you anything in return. You talked to me about books and weather and small beautiful things, not because you wanted something from me, but because you believed I deserved to be treated with dignity." Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks. That's just how I believe people should be treated." "That's exactly my point," Victoria said softly. "You did it naturally, without thinking about it, because it's who you are. Do you know how rare that is?" When Victoria was discharged 2 weeks later, she asked Matthew if he would have dinner with her. Not as a patient and doctor, but as two people who had shared something meaningful and wanted to explore where it might lead. "I need you to know," Victoria said as they sat in a quiet restaurant far from the world of business dinners and social obligations she was used to, "that if you say yes to getting to know me better, you're signing up for a complicated life. There will be media attention, social expectations, people who will question your motives." Matthew reached across the table and took her hand, the same gentle touch that had helped awaken her from her coma. "Victoria, for the past 3 months, I've been talking to someone I thought might never respond, might never know that someone cared about her well-being. If you're willing to take a chance on a doctor who drives a 10-year-old car and thinks a perfect evening is reading medical journals and cooking dinner at home, then I'm willing to face whatever challenges come with loving you." Their relationship developed with the same gentle patience Matthew had shown during Victoria's recovery. They discovered shared values about service and making a difference, found joy in simple pleasures like walking through parks and visiting museums, and built a foundation of respect and genuine affection that had nothing to do with Victoria's wealth or Matthew's professional status. A year later, when Matthew proposed to Victoria in the hospital room, where she had first opened her eyes and seen his face, he said, "I fell in love with you when you were unconscious," which sounds ridiculous until I explain that I fell in love with the person I imagined you were based on your strength and resilience. Getting to know the real you has been even better than anything I imagined." Victoria accepted with tears in her eyes, saying, "You loved me when I couldn't love myself, when I couldn't even speak for myself." You saw worth in me when I was at my most vulnerable. That's the kind of love that lasts forever. Their wedding was held in the hospital chapel, with many of the staff who had cared for Victoria during her recovery in attendance. Dr. Reeves, who performed the ceremony as an ordained minister, spoke of love that begins in service and grows through devotion, of partnerships that honor both strength and vulnerability. The Ashford Foundation, which Victoria established after her recovery, became one of the most respected medical charities in the country, funding research into traumatic brain injury and supporting families during long-term medical crises. Matthew continued his work at the hospital, though Victoria's support allowed him to also pursue research that might help other patients find their way back from similar challenges. You know, Victoria often said when people asked about their love story, most people think Matthew saved my life by being there when I woke up. But the truth is, he saved my life long before that, by treating me with kindness and dignity. When I couldn't advocate for myself, he reminded me that I was worth caring about, and that reminder became the strength I needed to fight my way back. And Matthew, watching his wife work with families facing medical crises similar to what she had endured, would add quietly, love isn't always about dramatic gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about showing up consistently, treating people with gentleness when they're at their most vulnerable, and believing in their worth, even when they can't see it themselves.